Consistency is not about willpower alone. It's about creating predictable neural patterns. The brain thrives on repeated cues, and behaviors become automatic when linked to specific times, environments, or rituals. Motivation is unreliable because it fluctuates with mood, energy, and circumstances. Discipline is about taking action regardless of how you feel. Consistency is built when action precedes emotion, not the other way around. Each time you repeat a behavior, you strengthen the neural circuits that support it. Consistency is less about perfection and more about frequency. Missing once doesn't ruin progress, but repeated breaks weaken the circuitry. Consistency requires reducing friction. By designing your environment to make the desired behavior obvious and accessible, you rely less on mental effort and more, rather than saying, I want to work out, you say, I am someone who trains daily. Identity-based framing solidifies habits and forces alignment between actions and self-image. When we talk about forcing ourselves to be consistent, the conversation often starts with the idea of willpower. People believe that if they could just summon enough willpower, they could stick with anything, whether it's exercise, studying, eating better, or building a business. But the truth is, willpower is fleeting. It burns out quickly because it relies on a limited supply of mental energy. What drives true consistency isn't simply white-knuckling through tasks, but rather understanding how the brain and nervous system adapt to repeated actions and environments. The brain thrives on patterns. At its core, the nervous system is designed to detect, respond to, and anticipate repeated signals. When you wake up at the same time every day, your circadian clock adapts to that rhythm and primes you to be alert at that hour without it. When you train yourself to study at the same desk, your brain begins to associate that location with focus. When you consistently show up at the gym, your muscles aren't the only things adapting. Your brain is building a feedback loop that makes it easier to return the next day. This is the essence of consistency. Repetition wires circuits that automate behavior. Think of consistency as removing negotiation from the equation. Each time you decide whether to do something, your brain engages its decision-making machinery, weighing short-term comfort against long-term benefit. This negotiation is exhausting, and more often than not, the brain leans toward immediate comfort. But if the behavior is performed at the same time, in the same context, and in the same way, the decision-making process is bypassed. The brain stops asking, should I do this? And instead defaults to this is what I do. That shift is the transition from effortful behavior to automatic habit. This is why consistency is less about big bursts of effort and more about creating stability in small actions. Imagine someone trying to learn a new skill, like playing the guitar. Practicing for 5 hours once a week feels like a lot of effort, but it doesn't create the same neural changes as practicing for 20 minutes every day. The nervous system requires repeated activation to strengthen synaptic connection. With each repetition, certain neural pathways become more efficient, while others are pruned away. This process, known as neuroplasticity, is the biological foundation of consistency. Without repetition, the brain doesn't prioritize. That pathway is something worth maintaining. Consistency also provides predictability, and predictability lowers stress. The human brain is a prediction machine. When it knows what's coming next, it conserves energy and reduces anxiety. By doing the same set of behaviors every day upon waking, you remove uncertainty from the start of the day and immediately place your brain in a state of familiarity. Even something as simple as always making coffee before opening your laptop signals to your nervous system that focus is about to begin. Over time, those repeated cues create a mental state that is easier to access. Another important point about the science of consistency is that the body reinforces it through physiological responses. For instance, when you exercise at the same time daily, your body begins to anticipate physical exertion at that hour by adjusting hormone levels, increasing body temperature, and preparing energy substrates. In other words, your biology supports your routine. The same goes for sleep. Going to bed and waking up at irregular hours disrupts hormone release, body temperature regulation, and neural repair processes. But aligning your sleep-wake cycle with consistency strengthens not just mental focus, but overall. The challenge many people face is that they chase motivation instead of leaning on structure. Motivation feels powerful when it's there, but it's unreliable because it depends on mood, energy, and external circumstances. The science of consistency teaches us that what really matters is reducing reliance on fleeting emotional states and instead building systems that lock behavior into place. This is why athletes, musicians, scientists, and high performers in any field often talk about their routines as non-negotiable. They don't wait until they feel like practicing, training, or working. They have wired their brain to default into those actions because they've repeated them so many times under the same conditions. Consistency is also self-reinforcing. Every time you follow through on a behavior, even when you don't feel like it, your brain logs evidence that you are capable of following through. This builds self-trust, and self-trust is the bedrock of discipline. When you skip repeatedly, your brain also logs that pattern, reinforcing the identity of someone who quits. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between a small choice and a big one. It only cares about repetition. This is why it is critical to protect even the smallest action. Doing something consistently, no matter how small, sends a powerful message to your brain that this behavior is part of who you are. The mistake many people make is believing consistency means perfection. Neuroscience shows that missing once does not erase progress. What matters is avoiding consecutive misses because the brain begins to weaken those circuits when they aren't reinforced. If you miss a day, the key is to return immediately rather than spiraling into avoidance. Consistency is not about never failing. It is about returning quickly after setbacks. That rapid return is what keeps the neural circuits strong. Ultimately, the science of consistency teaches us that success doesn't come from massive single efforts, but from repeated signals to the brain that carve deep pathways of behavior. Each cue, each repetition, each small decision to show up strengthens those circuits. The nervous system rewards patterns. The more predictable the pattern, the less mental energy required, and the more automatic the behavior becomes. Over time, what once felt like forcing yourself turns into something effortless because the brain and body no longer resist the behavior. They expect it. When most people think about making a change in their life or sticking to a goal, the first thing they search for is motivation. They want to feel inspired, energized, and emotionally pulled toward action. But motivation is inherently unreliable. It comes in waves, often sparked by external events or a sudden burst of emotion, and just as quickly as it arrives, it disappears. Relying on motivation is like trying to power a long journey with short bursts of fuel. It might get you moving, but it won't take you. Discipline, on the other hand, is the engine that keeps you moving forward even when motivation is nowhere to be found. Discipline is the ability to take action regardless of your emotional state. It doesn't ask, do I feel like it today? It simply says, this is what needs to be done. The brain naturally prefers comfort and immediate gratification because those are easier and require less energy. Motivation aligns with that preference. It feels good, so we go along with it. Discipline, however, often means overriding that instinct for comfort. It requires engaging neural circuits in the prefrontal cortex that are responsible for executive function, decision-making, and long-term planning. This is why discipline feels effortful, but also why it is so effective. It bypasses the fleeting emotional state and relies on deliberate choice. There's an important distinction between the momentary spark of motivation and the structured power of discipline. Motivation is reactive. It tends to appear when conditions are favorable, when you're well rested, excited by new possibilities, or inspired by a story or speech. But what happens the next day when you're tired, stressed, or distracted? That motivational spark is gone. And if you rely on it, you end up stuck in cycles of starting and stopping. Discipline is proactive. It doesn't wait for circumstances to be perfect. It acts consistently regardless of how you feel. That consistency is what actually builds momentum over time. Consider exercise as an example. On days when energy is high, it's easy to feel motivated to work out. But the real test comes on the days when energy is low, when you're sore, or when you'd rather relax. Discipline is the mechanism that gets you to the gym anyway. Each time you act in spite of resistance, you strengthen the neural pathways that make disciplined action more natural in the future. The nervous system learns from repetition, and when discipline is repeated, it becomes easier and requires less conscious effort. In other words, the more you practice discipline, the less you have to rely on raw willpower. Another way to understand the difference is to look at the role of emotions. Motivation is deeply tied to emotional states. It thrives on novelty, excitement, and external reinforcement. But emotional states are unstable. They fluctuate with sleep, nutrition, stress, and countless external variables. Discipline, by contrast, is not dependent on emotion. It relies on structure, systems, and routines that operate independently of how you feel in the moment. This is why discipline often looks boring from the outside. It's the repetition of small, consistent actions day after day, but that very repetition is what produces transformation. The science of habit formation supports this idea. When you take consistent action, especially in the same context or environment, your brain starts to automate the behavior. Over time, you don't need to summon motivation because the behavior itself becomes part of your identity. You no longer say, I hope I feel motivated to write today. Instead, you say, I am someone who writes daily. Discipline bridges the gap between where you are and that identity shift. It is the repeated choice to act, even in the absence of motivation, that cements the behavior into who you are. There's also a psychological reward system tied to discipline that many people overlook. Every time you act with discipline, you experience a sense of accomplishment and control. That feeling isn't dependent on external outcomes. It comes from the act of showing up. This triggers dopamine release, which reinforces the behavior and makes it more likely to occur again. In contrast, waiting for motivation often leads to frustration and guilt when it doesn't appear. Discipline creates a feedback loop where action produces reward, and reward reinforces further action. This loop is far more stable than chasing fleeting bursts of motivation. It's also important to recognize that discipline doesn't mean pushing yourself to extremes every single day. Discipline is about showing up and doing the work regardless of scale. Sometimes that means a full, intense workout. Other times it means just going through the motions to keep the habit alive. The key is that discipline removes the decision-making process. You don't ask yourself whether you feel like it. You simply follow the structure you've built. This reduces the cognitive load on the brain and conserves energy, which is critical for maintaining consistency over the long term. Many people imagine discipline as a form of punishment or self-denial, but that isn't accurate. True discipline is about alignment with long-term goals and values. Woo. It is the recognition that immediate comfort often conflicts with deeper fulfillment. Choosing discipline is choosing alignment with the person you want to become, rather than indulging in the momentary state you're currently in. This shift in perspective turns discipline from a burden into a form of empowerment. You're not forcing yourself to suffer. You're proving to yourself that you can act in service of your future, regardless of temporary obstacles. Ultimately, the reason discipline surpasses motivation is because it is reliable. Motivation will come and go like weather patterns, but discipline is the infrastructure you build that holds steady through highs and lows. It becomes the backbone of progress, the thing you can lean on when everything else feels unstable. By training yourself to prioritize discipline over motivation, you create a system where action drives emotion rather than waiting for emotion to drive action. And that inversion of the process is where real lasting change begins. At the core of building consistency lies one of the most fascinating features of the human brain, neuroplasticity. This is the ability of the nervous system to change in response to experience, to strengthen certain connections and weaken others based on what you repeatedly do. It is often said that neurons that fire together wire together, and that phrase captures the essence of why repetition is the foundation of any lasting habit. Each time you engage in a behavior, you are literally sculpting your brain. The more you repeat that behavior, the more efficient and automatic it becomes, because the underlying neural circuits adapt to make the action easier to perform in the future. Neuroplasticity is not reserved for childhood or adolescence, although those are times when the brain is more malleable. Adults also experience profound plasticity, especially when behaviors are repeated consistently and tied to a meaningful goal. What this means is that even if you have struggled for years with inconsistency, your nervous system is still capable of change. The catch is that change doesn't come from occasional bursts of effort. It comes from frequent, repeated actions that tell your brain, this is important, this is worth keeping. Consider what happens in the motor cortex when you practice a skill like playing an instrument or performing a sport. Each time you repeat the motion, specific neural pathways become more refined. At first, the action may feel clumsy or forced because the brain is still recruiting circuits inefficiently. But with repetition, the brain prunes away unnecessary connections and strengthens the ones that matter most. Over time, the action feels smoother, more fluid, and eventually automatic. The same principle applies to any habit you want to build, whether it's exercising regularly, reading daily, or waking up early. The repetition wires the habit into your nervous system, so it requires less conscious effort. It is also important to understand the role of dopamine in this process. Dopamine is often described as the molecule of motivation, but more accurately, it signals salience. Tells the brain what to pay attention to and what to prioritize for future action. Each time you repeat a behavior and receive some kind of a reward, whether external or internal, dopamine reinforces the circuits involved in that behavior. This is why celebrating small wins matters. When you acknowledge your progress, even in a subtle way, you are increasing the likelihood that your brain will want to repeat the behavior again. Dopamine combined with repetition makes habits stick. Repetition also creates resilience within neural circuits. Missing a single day of practice or habit does not undo your progress because the circuits remain primed. The danger lies in repeated breaks. When you stop engaging in a behavior for extended periods, the brain begins to weaken those connections through a process called synaptic pruning. This is the brain's way of conserving energy. It eliminates pathways that are not frequently used. That is why consistency, even at a small scale, is more powerful than sporadic intensity. A daily 5-minute practice builds stronger circuits than a once-a-week effort, no matter how big that effort may seem. One of the common mistakes people make is expecting neuroplasticity to happen overnight. The brain does adapt quickly in some ways, but lasting change requires persistence. And neural circuits are like trails in a forest. The first time you walk through, the path is rough and overgrown. With each pass, the trail becomes clearer, smoother, and easier to follow. Eventually, the trail becomes the default route, while the unused paths grow over. The same is true of your behaviors. The circuits you repeat become dominant, and the ones you neglect fade away. This process doesn't just happen at the behavioral level. It is physically reflected in the strengthening of synapses, the growth of dendritic spines, and the efficiency of neural firing. Repetition also interacts with timing. Doing the same behavior at the same time each day enhances plasticity because the brain learns to associate specific times with specific actions. This is why routines are so powerful. They don't just structure your day, they condition your nervous system. When you consistently study at the same hour, your brain begins to shift into focus mode automatically at that time. When you exercise at a set time, your body prepares by adjusting hormone levels and energy availability. The combination of repetition and timing makes the circuits even stronger, embedding the behavior into your daily rhythm. Another fascinating aspect of neuroplasticity is that it doesn't distinguish between positive and negative habits. Whatever you repeat, the brain learns to favor. If you consistently procrastinate, your brain reinforces that avoidance pathway. If you consistently engage in distractions, those circuits grow stronger. This is why it's critical to be intentional about what you repeat. The nervous system is impartial. It doesn't care if the habit serves your growth or undermines it. It simply adapts to what you do most often. Recognizing this fact is empowering because it means you always have the ability to redirect plasticity toward behaviors that serve you better. The relationship between repetition and identity is also profound. As behaviors become ingrained through neuroplasticity, they stop feeling like external tasks and start feeling like extensions of who you are. At first, going to the gym might feel like something you have to force yourself to do. But after months of repetition, your brain has rewired itself to expect and prepare for that behavior, and you begin to view yourself as someone who trains consistently. The repetition doesn't just change the circuits in your brain, it changes the story you tell about yourself. Identity becomes the anchor that keeps the behavior in place, And the more the behavior aligns with that identity, the stronger the circuits become. What makes repetition so powerful is that it transforms effort into ease. At the beginning of any new habit, the friction is high because the neural circuits are not yet optimized. But every repetition lowers that friction just a little bit more. Eventually, what once felt like a massive effort becomes second nature. And you don't debate whether to do it. You simply do it because your brain and body are wired that way. That is the gift of neuroplasticity. It rewards persistence by making behaviors automatic, freeing up mental energy for other challenges. Consistency is rarely the result of sheer willpower. While it's easy to assume that people who follow strict routines are simply more disciplined, the deeper truth is that they have learned how to design their environment in ways that make consistency inevitable. The brain and body respond strongly to cues, and by shaping the environment to present the right cues at the right time, you reduce the mental friction that often derails good intentions. Triggers in environments are the scaffolding upon which habits are built. Without them, even the strongest desire for change can collapse under the weight of distraction and fatigue. The human nervous system is highly sensitive to context. Whenever you walk into a familiar space, your brain immediately activates associations tied to that environment. A kitchen may prompt thoughts of food, while a gym triggers preparation for movement. This is not a conscious process. It happens automatically because the brain has linked the environment to a certain set of behaviors. Designing consistency means taking advantage of this automatic linking and creating intentional triggers that nudge you toward the behaviors. One of the most powerful ways to friction refers to any barrier, however small, that makes a behavior harder to start. For example, if your running shoes are buried in the back of a closet, the extra effort of finding them creates just enough friction for your brain to lean toward avoidance. But if your shoes are placed by the door the night before, you remove that obstacle and make the behavior almost automatic. Similarly, if you want to read more, keeping a book on your desk instead of tucked away on a shelf makes it far more likely you'll pick it up. These environmental tweaks may seem minor, but the brain interprets them as significant cues that either promote or discourage action. Designing triggers also means stacking new habits onto existing. The nervous system thrives on patterns, and when one action consistently follows another, the brain learns to pair them together. For instance, if you want to build a journaling habit, you might decide to write for 5 minutes immediately after making your morning coffee. Over time, the act of pouring coffee itself becomes a trigger for journaling. This technique, sometimes called habit stacking, leverages the brain's natural tendency to link events and environments into predictable sequence. By intentionally creating these sequences, you make the desired behavior part of your routine without relying on extra willpower. The timing of environmental cues also plays a crucial role. Performing a behavior at the same time every day trains your circadian system to anticipate that behavior. If you consistently train at 7 a.m., your body will begin adjusting hormone levels, body temperature, and energy availability to prepare for exertion. The environment you construct around that time, laying out workout clothes, preparing water, and having a designated training space becomes a powerful set of triggers that reinforce the behavior. It's not just about doing the action, it's about priming your brain and body to expect and prepare for the action. Another aspect of designing environments is removing competing cues. The brain is constantly bombarded with signals, and whichever cues are most salient often dictate behavior. If you are trying to reduce screen time but your phone is always in sight, the visual trigger makes it far harder to resist. By placing the phone in another room during focus work, you eliminate the cue and reduce the likelihood of distraction. The same principle applies to nutrition. Keeping unhealthy snacks within easy reach trains your brain to associate the environment with. Well, stocking the space with healthier options shifts the default behavior, but it also includes social contexts. The people you surround yourself with act as living triggers. If you spend time with individuals who value health, discipline, and consistency, their behaviors reinforce your own. If your environment is full of people who constantly indulge in distractions or avoidance, those cues pull you in the opposite direction. The brain's mirror neuron system makes us highly sensitive to social signals, often copying behaviors without conscious. Designing consistency, therefore, isn't just about physical space. It's about choosing environments, communities, and relationships that align with the habits you want to build. It's also useful to recognize that triggers can operate. Smells, sounds, and visual patterns can all serve as anchors for behavior. A specific playlist might cue focus, while a particular scent could mark the start of meditation. These sensory triggers work because they engage the limbic system, the part of the brain deeply tied to memory and emotion. By deliberately pairing sensory cues with desired actions, you can create powerful associations that make the behavior easier to initiate. Importantly, the process of designing triggers and environments doesn't require perfection. What matters is intentionality. Each adjustment you make to reduce friction, each cue you set up to guide behavior, and each distraction you remove strengthens the likelihood of consistency. Over time, the brain adapts by embedding these cues into its circuitry so that the behavior no longer feels like something you have to force foot in. Instead, it feels like the natural response to the environment you've created. When people struggle with consistency, it's rarely because they lack motivation or discipline. More often, it's because their environment is full of cues that pull them in the wrong direction and lacking in cues that push them toward their goals. By taking control of these triggers, you shift the balance in your favor. You no longer fight against your environment. You allow your environment to work for you. The brain is a prediction machine, and when it repeatedly encounters the same cues, it begins to expect and prepare for the associated behaviors. Designing those cues intentionally is the key to making consistency not just possible, but inevitable. True consistency doesn't just come from repetition, willpower, or even carefully designed environment. Those elements are important, but the deepest and most sustainable form of consistency is built when a behavior becomes tied to your identity. When you no longer view an action as something you are trying to do, but instead as something you are, it becomes nearly impossible to separate the behavior from the self. This shift from external effort to internal identity creates resilience. Because when challenges arise, you are not just protecting a habit, you are protecting who you believe yourself to be. The human brain has a powerful drive to stay consistent with its self-image. Identity acts like an internal compass, guiding decisions and behaviors, even when external circumstances are difficult. If you identify as someone who values health, skipping workouts feels like a violation of self, not just a missed session. If you see yourself as a disciplined student, avoiding study time feels like betraying your own character. This is why building identity around habits creates resilience. Your actions are no longer negotiable tasks on a to-do list. They are expressions of who you are. Neuroscience helps explain this. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, interacts heavily with regions of the brain responsible for self-concept, such as the medial prefrontal cortex. When behaviors align with identity, these circuits reinforce each other, making decisions easier and reducing internal conflict. On the other hand, when actions contradict identity, the brain experiences dissonance, a state of tension that demands resolution. People naturally seek to resolve this tension by either changing behavior to match identity or reshaping identity to justify behavior. The more strongly you anchor your desired habits to identity, the more likely you are to choose behaviors that support them. A clear example can be found in language. Notice the difference between saying, "I'm trying to quit smoking" versus "I'm not a smoker." The first statement frames the behavior as a struggle, something external you're attempting. The second frames it as an identity. When you tell yourself, "I'm not a smoker," the behavior of avoiding cigarettes is not a forced decision. It's simply acting in alignment with who you are. This identity-based framing makes resilience natural because the brain prioritizes self-consistency. It will resist anything that contradicts the internal story. The power of identity extends to resilience during setbacks. Everyone will encounter obstacles, failures, or days when consistency breaks. If your approach is purely behavioral, those setbacks can feel devastating, as though all progress has been undone. But if your identity is tied to the behavior, a setback doesn't define you. It it becomes a temporary misstep. For example, if you identify as a writer, missing a day of writing doesn't make you not a writer. It simply means you didn't write that day, but the core of your identity remains intact. This mindset makes it far easier to recover quickly and continue forward without spiraling into avoidance. Building identity around habits is not about pretending or forcing yourself into a label. It begins with small, consistent actions that provide evidence to your brain of who you are becoming. Each time you follow through on a behavior, you are casting a vote for that identity. The more votes you accumulate, the stronger that identity becomes. Over time, the brain integrates these patterns into self-concept, and the identity becomes stable. This stability is what fuels resilience. When challenges arise, you don't have to rely on fragile motivation. You simply act in alignment with the identity you've already built. Environment and community also play a role in shaping identity. Humans are social beings, and much of our self-image is influenced by the groups we belong to. Surrounding yourself with people who embody the identity you want strengthens your own commitment. If you want to be someone who prioritizes health, being in a community of health-focused individuals reinforces that identity. The mirror neuron system in the brain makes us naturally mimic the behaviors and values of those around us, which means your environment not only influences habits, but also helps sculpt your identity. Identity also connects deeply to purpose. When your actions are tied to a sense of meaning beyond immediate results, they take on a different weight. If you identify as someone who contributes to others, then showing up for your work, your relationships, or your studies isn't just about personal gain. This alignment between identity and purpose provides resilience during difficult times because the behavior is no longer just about effort, it's about meaning. And meaning is far more durable than motivation. It's important to recognize that identity can either work for you or against you. If you adopt disempowering identities, telling yourself that you're lazy, undisciplined, or inconsistent, your brain will find ways to reinforce those labels. Every skipped action becomes evidence of that identity, making it harder to change. Reframing identity requires consciously choosing the story you tell yourself and backing it up with action, even in small increments. Identity is not fixed, it is plastic. Just like the brain, the key is to choose an identity aligned with the habits and values you want, then consistently reinforce it with behavior. The most resilient individuals are those who see their desired behaviors not as tasks to complete, but as reflections of who they are. They don't need to force themselves every day because the identity does the heavy lifting. When you anchor habits to identity, setbacks become temporary, decisions become simpler, and consistency becomes a natural expression of self. This alignment between who you believe yourself to be and how you act creates an unshakable foundation for resilience and long-term growth. Consistency is not built on fleeting sparks of motivation, but on the deliberate training of the brain and body to expect and embrace certain behaviors. It emerges when discipline overrides the need to feel inspired, when repetition sculpts lasting neural pathways, when environments and triggers are designed to make the right choices automatic, and when actions are tied to a strong sense of identity. Each of these elements reinforces the others. Discipline strengthens repetition. Repetition builds plasticity, environments reduce friction, and identity provides resilience. Together, they form a system where effort turns into habit, and habit transforms into character. The process of forcing yourself to be consistent is really about rewiring your nervous system and reshaping your self-image so that what once required tremendous willpower eventually becomes who you are.